I just became an island boy. I'm just going to live on an island
Hmm.
and isolate. And
Yeah.
if you're not related to me or not one of my children, then I really don't. It's not. I'm going to be completely kind, but you're just not going to have access to any part of me. I went into this self-protective
Hmm.
isolation, not trust anybody, and that's a very unhealthy way to respond when life just isn't going the way you want it to go.
Welcome to an Inspirational People interview on the Share Life podcast. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and today I'm speaking with Benjamin Crawshaw, co-author of the recently published book, The Path: What If the Way of Jesus is Different Than You Thought? Benjamin and I were connected through our mutual friend, Leslie Haynes, who led my Global X mission trip to Honduras in 2023. Benjamin serves as the Director of Member Engagement for TrueFace. Previously, he headed up the content development for the Rocket Company, a church resourcing organization, and led the student initiative XP3 Students in High School Camp at the Rethink Group. Before this, Benjamin also served as the creative director of the high school ministry at North Point Community Church and holds a degree of English from Lee University in Cleveland, Tennessee. So, Benjamin, thank you for joining us today. Tell us about you and your story.
Yeah, first off, thank you for having me on your podcast. Leslie, she speaks highly of you. So if
Yeah,
Leslie speaks highly of you, then I think high things of you. So
appreciate it. Thank you, Leslie, for the kind words.
yes, incredible. Yeah, I again appreciate you having me on here. For me, my background, grew up in the church, came out of college doing ministry. And
What denomination did you grow up
so
in?
I grew up at a small, kind of the beginning of what we call the non-denominational
Okay, yeah,
churches. So
yeah.
pretty healthy, grace-based church. So was fortunate to grow up I didn't have like to unravel a bunch of baggage from my church of origin, which I know is rare. So
Yeah.
great experience, and came out of college, you know, wanting to do ministry, wanting to do all these things for God, right? And worked at the small church, worked at the big church, worked at a parachurch organization, wrote a book, sold a bunch of copies, started a camp, and then that camp lost a bunch of money. And then I wrote another book, and then no one bought it. And then I wrote another book, and no one except my mom read it. And then I got divorced, and then I say I didn't burn out in ministry. I just exploded across the
Okay.
sky. You know, I just
What age were you?
so at this point in time, I was my late 30s.
Okay. And what
And
year was that?
so
Or
really, I think things really began unraveling kind of professionally and personally around, I would say, 2014,
okay.
2015.
Yeah.
And then by the time, 2000, I guess 18 hit, I was, out of
Hmm.
ministry completely and just trying to figure out life as an ex ministry person. So wasn't mad at God, wasn't mad at Christians. When anytime you get divorced and you're in the church space, there's some, always some opinions around that. But it was just, I'm never going to be involved in ministry ever again. I just
Hmm.
swore it off completely. Wasn't mad at it, still went to church. And then I just kind of this 24-hour period where my old church was reaching out to me about being the student pastor. And I was like, no, not going to do it. Please don't ask me. My daughter was 5 at the time,
Yeah.
and they were asking me to be her softball team's coach.
Hmm.
And I was like, no, I don't want to, I'm not going to do that. So the guy calls me and he said, your daughter's on a team. They have no coach. Will you coach? And I was like, fine, I'll coach the stupid team. Then I went to lunch with one of my former students in my first student ministry and walked out of there. And somehow I agreed to being the student pastor of my old church. There was 4 students. So it was
Hmm.
like this overnight thing, Jason, where I went from being like, no one, talk to me or bother me, to all of a sudden I'm coaching a team and I'm back to being a student pastor. So
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess tell me like, I guess I want to go back to like this blow up.
right.
What would you say were what was the stacks of dynamite that were being placed around you or inside of you over time that led to that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the stacks of dynamite is, I think growing up, and I may not have been taught this consciously, Jason, but I
Yeah.
had this subconscious thought that, influence equals currency. Some people grow up in churches where dad wants you to go make a lot of money. And
Yeah.
I feel like I grew up in an environment where you want to go reach big audiences, right? Like tell
Mm.
the world about Jesus.
Yeah.
And so I was, I guess, climbing, for lack of a better term, in the audiences I was speaking to. I was kind of the flavor of the month as far as like the student speaker, going and
Yeah.
speaking at student events. So I think the first stack of dynamite was wrapping up my identity up in who I was as a person in ministry.
Yeah.
And I think, and then if you wrap your identity up in anything and then it fails, then you're left scrambling. And
Hmm.
so all I had left at that point was my family, and my family was falling apart at the same time. So
Yeah.
I think anything that I could seep my claws into as part of my identity was all withering in front of me. And so then you're left with, not much.
Yeah. So are you implying that a lot of your identity was externally created, and then as that withered away, you had nothing internal to sort of replace it?
I don't know if I'm implying that as much as I'm explicitly saying that. Yes. It was all wrapped up in externals. And I don't think I was aware of that. I think
Yeah.
as things kind of fell apart, it just went to being a dad. And so spent all my time into just being a dad and finding all my identity in that. It took me a long time and a lot of counseling to begin to start searching for a different place to find my
Yeah.
identity.
So how would you respond to this statement? You kind of expected life to be a certain way. You experienced reality, and it was not what you expected. There was a disconnect between the reality and what you had been told, what you had expected. How would you respond to that statement?
I would respond to that like that's a pretty good, yeah, that's a pretty accurate display of what happened. And my response to that was awful.
Hmm.
So I didn't handle it well. I don't know. Do you feel like everybody reaches this moment in life to a certain degree, or is it maybe just
Yeah,
me?
I would agree with that. I would say that some of us reach it at different ages. Like some might be earlier than others, but we all experience that. I think a sense of disillusionment
Right.
at some level, and also the world changes. So the way we could have accomplished something 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago may not be the same today. So there's also the world is changing. And
Right.
I think that's another dynamic that's at play. And then there are also all these sort of unintended layers and consequences of things that blind spot, so to speak,
Right.
that that also have a power dynamic. So when you are
Right.
not the person that has the power versus the person that is under the power, you see different things, and so those blind spots are different for the
Yeah.
two parties. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
I mean, it does. I mean, my dad, he's around the corner in the other room right now. My dad's lived a great life from external standards. Pastor, retired as a pastor, great family. His grandkids love him. Him and my mom have 4 acres up in Dahlonega, and he will still have conversations with me about like, this is not the way I pictured it. And he's not being discontent. He's not being unhappy. I think it's just what you're saying. We all have this vision of what life is going to look like. And for all of us in our own little ways, it just hasn't worked out the way we thought it was
Mhm.
going to.
yeah, and some of that can be because we don't we want different things.
Right.
Some of it could be how we want those different things is also different.
Right.
So those play a factor, but there is that inside out shift or outside in being externally shaped as a person,
Right.
which I think to some degree is normal and healthy, but at some point we have to self-author, right? We have to
Right.
sort of take ownership, and so I think what I'm hearing from you is when that moment arrived, instead of taking ownership, you blamed or you pushed away or you said you handled it badly. So tell us about that.
Yeah. I think it's just, I went into isolation,
Mhm.
and as opposed to, okay, I sense that there's something off in a lot of parts of my life. So let me get into healthy places where I can process that, have other people feeding in or speaking into what's happening. I just became an island boy. I'm just going to live on an island
Mhm.
and isolate. And
Yeah.
if you're not related to me or not one of my children, then I really don't. It's not. I'm going to be completely kind, but you're just not going to have access to any part of me. So
Yeah.
I think I went into this self-protective
Hmm.
isolation, not trust anybody. And yeah, I think that's a very unhealthy way to respond when life just isn't going the way you want it to go.
Yeah. What did that give you by doing that?
It gave me a great deal of anxiety,
Yeah.
but it gave me a sense of I think feeling like I could control what I can control.
Mm.
I mean, parenting, I don't, you have kids,
Yeah,
Jason?
I got 5 kids.
Yeah. Parenting is not you can't really control anyone,
Yeah.
and you can't control your kids. However, you can get some stuff checked off the to-do list when it comes to kids. There is a sense of control. Like I can make sure they get their homework done. I can make sure they go to bed. Like I can at least check that off my list. I can make sure that we have a conversation about this, or I address this part of their behavior, or I
Yeah.
connect with them in a meaningful way. There's enough things that I can control about parenting to feel like, that's I'm doing something.
Yeah.
But what I can do without parenting also is I can also not take care of my own soul.
Hmm.
I can neglect who I am at the heart of who I am. And so I think I went into head down, let's work so I can provide for my family. Let me connect with my kids the way I need to, discipline, all this stuff, connect, encourage, homework, bath time, bedtime, all that, and just let my heart be neglected the entire time.
Yeah. Now, would you also say that so in a sense your world ended. It came to an end. You experienced the apocalypse, right? But life kept going, and so it opened up the possibility that the world keeps going. So how do you think about that idea? Like the worst case scenario may have unfolded for you in some way, but you didn't die. So how
Right.
do you reconcile that dynamic?
Oh man, how do you reconcile that dynamic? I mean, that is a good question. I think that um, there there were moments where I realized that my way of, I guess, quote unquote, coping with,
Hmm.
the world blowing up in front of me was not working. For example, and you have 5 children, so you've surely experienced this, when your identity then becomes shifted to being a parent. Well, now my identity, my oldest daughter was in either third or fourth grade. And I
Yeah.
remember one day took her to school. So my middle wasn't in kindergarten at that time. So she was the only one in, so I took her to school and then I was going about my day and she was just acting like a typical fourth grader, right?
Yeah.
Like, sometimes they're great and sometimes they're terrible, right? You've
Yeah.
experienced it. And I remember thinking, I think my identity is wrapped up in a 10-year-old or however old. Yeah, that's about how old a fourth grader is or a 9-year-old. I don't
Hmm.
think I want my identity to be at the mercy of a 9-year-old who's just trying to figure out 9-year-old life.
Yeah.
And so I saw these little glimpses of things not working. I saw these little glimpses of my heart being neglected, just little bits and pieces here and there. And then really when COVID hit is really when it all got exposed for me, Jason, because I had, again, work. Work was another exterior identity I could wrap up in. So I got my kids and I'm providing with them. That's my work. Well,
Yeah.
work on the second part of COVID, work began to kind of unravel a little bit. Some of my clients were falling apart. And then you can't go distract yourself because there's
Yeah.
nowhere to go when it comes to COVID.
Yeah.
You can't go be around the crowds and not engage with them, but just be present. And
Oh, so
so,
and particularly because of your identity being about an audience, it had a more of a maybe a dramatic impact than someone with a different type of identity.
well, yeah, now that you put it that way, that's a pretty articulate way to put it. I hadn't thought of it
Yeah.
like that, but yeah, I hear what you're saying. Pretty
Yeah.
clear, pretty
I mean, if
accurate
you're used to
diagnosis
performing
there.
in front of an audience and all of a sudden audiences are gone, that's a big deal, you know?
Yeah, I mean, at that point I wasn't, but yeah,
Yeah.
I hear
Yeah.
what you're saying. I think
Yeah.
that I had enough distractions to where I didn't have to peer inside of myself. So anyway, I was walking on a soccer field. My mom was at the house watching my kids. I went for a walk, and I all of a sudden I'm just weeping, and I'm not. People who are criers. I would admit if I am, I'm just not. I'm not an emotional person, and I'm crying. And I was like, man, there's something wrong here, and I called up my counselor and I was like, "Hey, do you have any openings?" And she's like, "Well, I don't have many. You'd be amazed at how busy I am right now. This being lockdown at COVID, as a counselor, she's crushing it. This was like a heyday for her, right?
Yeah.
She worked me in, and this was the beginning of me starting to lift up the hood and peer at what's inside.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've ever gone through that process.
Yeah.
It's like if you decided to redecorate your kitchen or remodel your
Remodel.
kitchen, right? And you're like, oh man, this looks awesome. This is going to be great. And then you come home one day and everything's gutted out and,
Mm.
things are ripped off the wall and you can see the bare
Yeah.
earth underneath the floor. And you're like, oh my goodness, why did we do this? This was such a bad idea. That's what it was like for me. Going for that walk when I'm crying, when I was like, I need to remodel the kitchen, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then I started and I was like, why did I do this? This was a terrible
Yeah.
idea, but I'm so glad I did it looking back. And I had
Did you?
just a great counselor through all
Yeah.
that.
At what point did you experience a sense of dread?
Well, she did a great job of helping me back myself into the corner of what I needed to do, which was to grieve. So
Mm.
to think about the stuff that we've talked about, you know, life not going the way you wanted, unmet dream, through the camp falling apart, the marriage falling apart, through, um, you know, all of these things, and to never grieve the losses of those things. Somewhere around, I don't know, our fifth or sixth session, I could see her working me into that corner, and she did it without pushing anything, asking me questions. At one point, I'm getting frustrated, and I'm like, why do I pay you to just have me tell myself what I need to do? Like, why am I paying you for this? But I could see what she was doing. She was letting me walk myself. And so I left her office and I went and into the Kroger parking lot and I sat there in my car. And it was just like, I knew it was time for me to grieve what had happened in my life.
Mm.
And, you don't want to poke a hole in a water balloon. I didn't know what grief looked like. Does this mean I'm going to be in my room in the dark for 3 weeks just crying? But that was when I knew it was time to take that step. And I'm so grateful for her, and I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah. Have you read the book The Grieving Brain?
No, I did read a book called, I think is So She Laughs Again, written by a
Okay.
lady about her daughter who passed away of cancer, her young
Oh, okay.
daughter.
Wow.
And that was a helpful book for me at that time. But I'm not familiar with the book that you're
Yeah.
talking about.
Well, I read it and after the fact, and then looking back, I was like, oh yeah, there was a lot of grief there. I was dealing with grief.
Yeah,
It put words to what I was dealing with,
right,
and I also realized, like, just our country, I feel like we have a lot of unresolved grief
right.
um, that's building up. And so, what would you say to those people, particularly men? Like, I think grief is probably looked down upon in the male side of things. Would you agree with that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's actually a conversation that I find myself having with a lot of people now. And a guy who was kind of instrumental in my faith many years ago, a guy named Dave Busby, who was a communicator. He had polio, cystic fibrosis, but just like a real funny guy who could communicate to students in a way that like you just got people, but he could help people open up emotionally. And he had a really powerful chapter in his book called The Heart of the Matter that was about the grieving heart and just work he had done with students. And that was really powerful and helpful for me because, he's like, it's not about like going off into the dark and crying for days and days. It's just about getting what's inside outside of you, right? Lamentations in the Bible, that's just creating language to your pain. That's just verbalizing what you're feeling and you're dealing with. So my approach was to think of it more like an exercise that I did every day. And so grief is a part of it's like for people who are like, hey, I'm going to start walking. So if you said, I'm going to start walking, and I've never really walked before. So you go out and you start, you walk a couple blocks and then you kind of build up a little bit. It just becomes part of your daily routine. Grieving is the same way. It's just a muscle that you learn to work out and develop. because, these emotions that are undealt with or unverbalized or unprocessed, they're going to make their way out of you in some
Hmm.
way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And for me, they were just making their way out of me in an unhealthy way. So I said,
Yeah.
hey, I would rather, be aware of the conduit in which these emotions are making their way out of me, as opposed to having them show up in ways that I'm like, what was that? Who's that? Why did I do that? Why am I acting like this? And so it's this muscle that I believe that we can build on a regular basis. I think, to your point, I think this is an incredible exercise for anybody. I certainly think, as a country, everybody who went through this pandemic, that's what my counselor said. It was just, it wasn't like new things were showing up. The pandemic just exposed some things that were already true. We just couldn't find
Amplified.
a way to distract ourselves. And that's where I was at. So we have all this stuff, and just to feel like, man, I can build a muscle of processing this, creating language to my pain, verbalizing it. If you're a church Jesus person, you can invite God into it. If you're not, you can journal it, you can process, you can connect with other trusted, healthy people. There's all kinds of way to just get what's in you out of you.
Yeah. And I think a big part of it is to grieve is also to accept reality.
Right.
And part of why we're fighting it is because we don't want to accept it. We want to
Right.
fight it. And we have to accept it, and then we can see it for what it is, and then process it and move on.
Right. It's back pain. It's a strained relationship with one of your kids. It's a coworker. And I tell people, it's not grieving. We think of loss. We think of, a grandparent passing away. Where grief is, it is exactly what you said. Life doesn't look the way that I want it to look. My finances don't look the way that I want them to look. My marriage, my kids, my job, my body, my any of this, and verbalizing that and expressing that that's not what I want. That hurts, and I'm finding a healthy way to process that. To your point, it is also acknowledging that that's the reality right now.
Yeah.
We get this when someone passes away. I'm grieving them, but that's not going to bring them back, right?
Hmm.
And in the same way, some of these things we grieve, we can change, we can work on, and some of them that we can't. What have you found as far as grieving? What has worked for you?
Well, I think I guess one thing that comes to mind is after that era, I try and be as real time as possible with my grief.
Yeah.
So, and actually, funny enough, when I went to Honduras, Leslie was there when we went through this experience that was pretty dark and tragic, and I just felt the grief like almost
Right.
immediately. So I kind of had a moment with her where I let it out. So I try and take it and just get it out and process it like as quickly as possible, so it doesn't like build up into like
Yeah.
a bunch of things.
Right.
So that's one thing that I do is, and that some of that involves community and having someone that I can share it with,
Right.
that I trust, and someone being there with me when those, going into dark, tragic situations by yourself is probably not a ideal situation. But in that case, there was a team, and just preventing it. And part of that has to do with like when I went through my nervous breakdown, so to speak. A lot of the grief had built up, and
Right.
it was like a volcano of grief, but it was grief, just all these things that had built up for years and years and
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And
So
it's so, I mean, again, I'm not aware of all the details of what you're talking about, but I think back to me in the Kroger parking lot,
mhm.
knowing that I had a volcano in there somewhere.
Yeah,
But to now look back and to have gotten that out, oh my goodness, it's like
yeah,
it's so much freer and lighter. And I'm not saying life is free and light and easy now. I'm not saying that by any means. But to live now versus the way I lived then, with all that being stuffed, repressed, seeping its way out in different
mhm,
ways, is a huge difference. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Now, how would you what would you say to the shame of the experience in terms of, in your case, you got divorced and you were in the church, and so even if the church was generous in that, it's still, there's still a sense, I think, of a shame there. I don't know. Do you agree, disagree? How did you experience that?
Yeah, I think all of us, that's another part of our grief is it to us to recognize when there's something inside of me that is unprocessed that I need to process. It's also to recognize when I'm leaning back towards my shame story or my shame narrative. It may be a better way to put it is
Mm,
I think we all have these default things that we go to. A lot of times those are connected to maybe things that happen in our childhood. And so we find ourselves living out these narratives at times. And this was certainly one of them. I don't
hmm
know. I don't know that Foster, he does these primal questions, I think he calls them, that we try to ask, like, am I safe? Am I successful? Am I
mm,
loved? Am I wanted? Do I have purpose? These 7 questions or whatever. Well, mine is, am I wanted? Which I hate the fact that this is like my core question. But I think
yeah,
of myself being in
yeah,
6th grade, Jason. I asked a girl, it's a long, funny story. Wasn't
yeah.
funny to me back then, but it is now looking back. I asked her to be my date to the roller skating Christmas party. I went to a small private school,
Yeah,
and my sisters dropped me off, and I came in, and she was out on the roller skating rink holding hands with another guy, right?
yeah, yeah.
And as opposed to, laughing it off, making a joke about it, hanging out with the guys, or just saying, who cares? I sat on the bleachers at that roller skating rink, and it's just this thought that entered its way into my mind, which is just, I'm unwanted.
Yeah.
And it planted itself into my head. I mean, again, I have 3 older sisters. I was not going to verbalize this with anybody, keep it to myself, internalize it, repeat it. And it really had some kind of catastrophic impacts on my life. You can look at my relationships through high school and even part of college and be like, yeah, you were living under that narrative. But even today at 46, I can find myself sometimes leaning towards that shame narrative
Hmm.
of being unwanted. And I think we all have these different wounds, these different experiences, whether it be from our family, our parents, our experiences with other people. Most of our shame has to do with some relational experience that happened at some point in formative years. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think certainly that's a part of it, is being able to recognize that I can grieve that, but also replacing those things with truth. What is the truth about who I
Hmm.
am? So
Yeah.
we're grieving. I think sometimes getting it out is enough. With shame, I think a lot of times it has to be replaced with a new narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of these experiences we have growing up that shape who we are when we're older in ways that are fundamental but also often invisible to us.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot
So
of times that's like part of our strength. I mean, part of what I think
hmm
I'm good at is helping people feel like they're included, helping people
hmm
feel like they're seen
yeah.
and they're listened to. When I'm at the grocery store, I remember things that are going on with people who work there, and I follow up. I mean, there's certainly, I think, a
Yeah.
strength to it that
Something you lacked, you want to give that to other people.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
there's a side to it that becomes very shame driven and shame based.
Yeah. Because then if you're trying to give, if you're trying to help, if you're trying to be, if you want to be wanted by somebody that won't want you, then you end up, you almost trap yourself in that situation because you're trying to get that something from them that they don't want to give you.
Yep,
Yeah.
been there a
Yeah.
few times in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which can be lead to like toxic relationships as well.
Yep.
So this, lots of layers here that we could probably unpack for years. But what have you learned about living well and living better from like what does that mean to you now and how has that changed over the
Yeah, I
years?
think, when you come out of the COVID situation and my work situation being, for the first time in my adult life, kind of struggling to figure out where I was going to make ends meet and all that, and reached out to Robbie Angle, who you may or may not know. He's the president and CEO of TrueFace. TrueFace is the
Okay.
ministry that created the Cure book and Bo's Cafe many years ago. And I reached out to him about, hey, you got any, job? I'm a writer, editor, and so had me work on a few projects with them, and then kind of brought me in a little bit more with TrueFace. And again, TrueFace this is about taking the mask off, not the COVID
Mhm.
mask, just the mask that we all use to
Yeah.
guard ourselves, and helping stuck Christians get unstuck. So I'm writing this stuff for TrueFace, and at one point I called him. I said, "Who's the, like, I don't know what they call it, the psychographic, the target person, So he's like, well, it's a middle-aged stuck Christian. And I was like, oh my goodness, TrueFace is for me. Like I'm editing these products, these resources that are for me. And so he continued to pull me in more so as a staff person. And I'm, writing about these, you know, identity-based, grace-based, high trust, authentic community things that I'm not even living myself. And, you know, went on a kind of a retreat, like a staff retreat with them, and went on a walk with a lady who works there. And she began to ask me questions, and I found myself opening up a little bit.
Yeah.
And, I've been guarded, isolated, right? And so now Jason, I'm sharing these things with her, and I'm like, oh no, what did I just do? I need to keep this stuff keep the guard up, keep the wall up. But they really did, and they do practice what they preach, so to speak. They really do model this sense of safety and authenticity and humility. And I was like, whatever that is, I don't have it, and I want more of it. And so really, through me being a part of that, it
Yeah.
was, hey, trusting God and trusting others is not a disconnected, it's not a disconnected thing. Jesus
Hmm.
said the greatest command is to love God, and the second one is like it. The second one is connected to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So the horizontal and the vertical, they run together. Well, God and I were fine. It was just all y'all that I had a problem with, right?
Yeah.
Because time and experience has taught me not to trust you. So God and I are good. God and I can stay on the island and be all good. I just don't want other people on my island except for my kids. And through TrueFace, it was learning to uncross my arms and open up to the idea of trusting other people with who I am. And that's been a total game changer for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because there's just I think for a lot of people can relate to that, and I think that's I guess why TrueFace has a business, right?
Right, right,
Because it's reaching those people. Um, but I think the other thing is that Jesus saw people as they really were, but he wasn't cynical about it, right? So
right.
we can become cynical, or we can be overly optimistic, and he kind of found a way to see them as they really were, but then also see the redemptive future for them as well.
Right. And I hear what you're saying. It's like, when you start talking about trusting other people, you have the person who's like trusted everybody they've ever met in your life. And you're like,
Hmm.
okay, hold on. Maybe let's not enter another dating relationship. Right.
Yeah.
And then the people who are, I'm not going to uncross my arms and trust anyone. I think the invert of that is humility. And
Yeah.
then curiosity is
Yeah.
I approach you with a sense of curiosity to learn more about you. So I'm not approaching you from a standpoint of judgment, which would
Hmm.
just say, I don't know Jason, so I don't trust him. Well, that's cynical. That's being judgmental. But it's like, I don't know Jason enough to like, can I trust him with all these aspects of my life? So it's humility and curiosity, and you just never, if I learn about somebody and I feel like, man, that may be a unhealthy person for me to open up my life with, but I still spent some time with them and learned about them, and I know how to care about them and think about them, then it's a win-win. I can just walk away saying, hey, I'm not going to trust that person with all these details of my life. But so again, I think what's the Ted Lasso, when he talks about growing up, people judged him. They didn't approach him with curiosity.
Mm.
Curiosity, you ask questions, where judgment, you just pre-decide what somebody is all about. So I think humility and curiosity is a great kind of middle ground. And nobody asked more questions than Jesus, right? So,
Yeah.
and nobody was more humble than Jesus. So he kind of was the best at all of that.
Now, what does it mean to work smarter? Like, how does this? You've mentioned how work has been a big piece of your story, provision, lack or struggle to provide in
Right.
these difficult seasons. So, talk to us about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you don't think money is an idol or a source of your identity until you aren't making any, right? It's like when I'm, being able to pay the bills because I'm not a like extravagant person who's got to buy the newest of everything. I think, yeah, money's not connected to my heart. But then when money goes away, you're like, yeah, maybe money is connected to my heart. And so I think looking back, work being stripped away from me, it was really good for me because I learned
Hmm.
a new degree of humility. I
Yeah.
learned yet another thing not to wrap my identity in it up because Jason, I would have never said any of my identity was wrapped up in money. And then when I went through those struggles, I was like, yeah, it's just another thing for me to learn that I had my identity wrapped up in that I
Hmm.
don't need to have my identity wrapped up in.
Yeah.
And, working to be diligent about, leads, LinkedIn, sending resumes at the same time, hoping doesn't always work out that way, but hoping I could find some work that lined up with my skill set and passion set and what I was good at. And it took some time, but yeah, it came around, and I'm grateful for yet another, humbling valley experience to help me in that regard.
Yeah. So how did mentoring play a role in all of this?
Well, I think my counselor served as a mentor. I think I had a guy that I reached out to who had kind of been through a similar divorce a couple of years before me, and then my parents just they inserted themselves into my life as mentors, like it or not, right?
Hmm.
And I think then as Trueface really taught me the power of trusting other people and being in high trust, authentic community, then getting into these relationships that are more, mutual mentorship, so to speak, it's not like I'm sitting at someone's feet and they're trying to fix me. It's like together, like Jason, you and I we could share what's going on in the last 10% of our lives. We could offer hope into each other's lives without either one of us being necessarily the mentor or the mentee. We are just, we're not at the same stage in life. So you may be
Hmm.
further down than me in certain areas and you can kind of coach me in that and vice versa. But it's just this idea of mutual mentorship as we go. And I'd
Hmm.
say once I uncross my arms to have some relationships like that, I would say 6, 7, 8 different relationships in my life that I think now serve as kind of mutual mentorship type relationships. It's been powerful, very powerful for me. What about you?
Yeah, I think it's important to what your the way you describe it connects to my mission statement, which is also the name of this podcast, which is called Share Life. So my mission statement is to share life, and it used to be to teach and inspire others, but I felt like I wanted it to be more of a mutual orientation, and I felt
Right,
like Share Life was you can share with me, I can share with you, and we both have something to share. And that means even when there's a difference in the relationship, it could be a parent and a child, it could be a mentor and a mentee, but it could be a boss and an employee. They both have something for the other. It's
right,
not just a one way thing, and I think it's unhealthy when we're on the upper side of the power dynamic to assume
right,
that we have it all because the person that's under us has part of the story.
right.
And so that reciprocity and that mutuality is a big part of just who I am and how I approach it. So I definitely can relate to what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think it's so great. If I'm, let's say I am in a quote mentor relationship, or as you said, the upper side of the power dynamic or the experience dynamic. Well,
Yeah.
what I want really is not for someone to tell me what they're struggling with so I can fix their problems. What I
Yeah.
want is for someone to be real with me,
Hmm.
and and to share with me what's really going on with them. And so the best way for me to do that is to model that.
Yeah.
So if you were to bring me a younger person and ask me, can you invest into this person's life? I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about stuff that I deal with and struggle with. Not,
Mm.
not, I'm not crossing the appropriate to share line. I'm not like just unloading on them with all my problems, but I am modeling for them what it looks like to be open and honest about what's going on in my life. And what happens a lot of those times is someone that you've been invested to invest in, they have all kinds of stuff to offer you that you hadn't even thought
Hmm.
of. So it
Yeah.
really is there. It doesn't really ever benefit us to take the approach of like, here I am, come learn from me or let me fix you. That never works. And
Yeah.
so if I'm going to model vulnerability, a lot of times it's just mutually beneficial for both of us as we go. So I think almost all mentorship is almost mutual mentorship. which is
Yeah.
why I love what you've done with your podcast.
Yeah. Thank you. How have real or fictional stories, narratives shaped you as a person?
I mean, I am an English major, so it's hard to read To Kill a Mockingbird and to not find yourself. I grew up in a county that was all white.
Mm,
And so when I was a senior in high school, the first uh, black student in the history of our county was a freshman at my public
mm,
school, and I was a senior.
yeah.
And so, I'm like, all right, I I want to defend her because I'm a senior and she's a freshman, and because she's facing obvious uh, struggles. Not because I'm trying to be some sort of hero in this situation, but because that's what Atticus Finch taught me, right?
Yeah.
Is what it looks like to step in and be a defender of people who are, um, that they're a little more powerless in the situation. And that's what narrative does. That's what story does. It gives you a sense of not just learning left brain information, but connecting the right side of your mind and your body. Your emotion lives within your body. And so narrative, I'm going to butcher this, but I'm listening to this study, I think the Huberman lab, where he talked about mice, the same neurons were activated in their brain when they saw good things happen to other mice as it was when it happened to them,
Mhm.
to them.
Yeah.
And so in narrative, there is a way for things to happen in my body and my brain that as if they were happening to me. And
Yeah.
that's the power of story. That's the power of, me hearing your story versus you downloading to me information that I can keep connected on the left side of my brain.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, how does that relate to this book that you've co-written?
Yeah. So the path, this is the path right here. I show it to you simply because it's a beautiful cover. Not all books
Yeah.
have a beautiful cover. And this one is we decided, like the book The Cure, which Trueface released many years ago, to be part narrative and a little less part teaching, so that you could find these truths played out in the context of a story, and then some application as to how that could apply in your own life.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was, especially in our attempt to reach the next generation, or Gen Z, Gen Alpha, to do it through narrative as opposed to doing it through left brain information. Because as you know, nobody has more access to information than Gen Z and Gen Alpha, right? Than
Hmm.
any generations in the history of all time, right? So narrative is our attempt to get out of just the left brain information into their hearts.
Yeah. And I would make the argument that the information is confusing or meaningless without the story that explains it.
Right. I was talking to someone about how, now we're in a post-Christian society, and he said, no, we're in a post-truth society, right? And so now with my 16-year-old, because I've taught her to question things that she hears or sees on social media. It could be fake news, it could be clickbait, it could be AI generated, right? So I've taught her, probably to a fault, to distrust, but to not believe everything that she sees or reads, because that's catastrophic in today's age,
Yeah.
right? And so to your point, yeah, you have to know context and all that. So that this is what I say is, where information has become elevated. Would you say, Jason, that at the same time trust is decreasing, at the same time information is increasing?
Yeah. Although it's a select, I think if I were to narrow it down, it's like a selective trust,
Right,
where trust, what we would consider as what we trusted traditionally and historically has changed.
right.
And then to your point, like then we start trusting things that are probably untrustworthy as well.
That's the
So
danger.
it's both sides of it. We're not trusting the trustworthy sources, and we're trusting the untrustworthy sources. It might be
Right,
worse.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is when, kind of what you were saying a second ago about, when you were talking about information, knowing the context and all of that stuff. It's why I think a lot of what experiences become elevated, because
Hmm.
maybe for me, where I was in environments where, I heard information, but I wasn't getting information all the time,
Yeah.
because I didn't have access to it on the phone. I mean, we weren't even really allowed to watch TV that much. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, information became this thing for me that was had a high appeal where I was experiencing more because I was on my bike and I was out.
Hmm.
I couldn't trade that for information necessarily unless all my experience happened at a library or something. But it was like everything was an experience for me. Where now some of the students I lead, they can be in their rooms with information at all times and then not having experiences. So experiences become elevated where information, the value of information becomes a little bit decreased because it's so saturated everywhere. Well, to create these authentic experiences, what a perfect time to introduce people to the gospel. Because this is what Jesus did. Jesus was very rarely going around telling people a bunch of information. He was
Yeah.
going around creating these authentic experiences with people, whether they agreed with him or not, whether they looked the same way as him or not, asking a lot of questions, engaging in
Yeah.
curious conversations, and just meeting people in the course of a conversation, which is exactly what you're doing in your podcast. You're not like, this is not an agenda. I'm not over here trying to like teach you something from the left brain. You're trying to engage in conversations and have real authentic relational experiences. And I think that's what the gospel is beautifully positioned for the next generation.
Yeah. So, how does this book share the gospel in this story?
Yeah, it's exactly the way that you talked about it. It's through story. The story of Tal, a young architect searching for fulfillment and meaning through accomplishment, and then through disillusionment, and then through an encounter with Jesus, and then through what it would look like to walk with Jesus, which I grew up, it was guilt. And again, no knock to anyone who taught me. So I'm not like taking shots at my childhood or anything, but it was guilt, fear, and then it was knowledge, and then it was behavior, right?
Hmm.
So you could go and I mean, first one of my first formative memories, Jason, is of my sister pushing me on the swing set, telling me, "Hey, you're going to hell, right?" And I was like, "Wait, what?" And she's like, "Yeah, because you're a sinner." And so then it was like, "Oh my goodness, I have to do something about this." And then you get into the church and they're like, "Yeah, you got to read and memorize these verses and do this and don't do that." And so it became a lot of behavior, became around knowledge, the KMD syndrome, know more, do better. Nothing
Hmm.
wrong with knowing more, doing better, but where the path we start with identity, understanding who you are in connection to who your creator says that you are. And maybe he's not the God that you pictured growing up, which is just up in the sky with his arms crossed, tapping his toes, waiting on you to get it together. Maybe he is more like the father from the prodigal son
Hmm.
parable, who's running to meet you, to put his arms around you and throw a party for you. Maybe
Yeah.
that's more so the way that he sees you. Well, let's start there as opposed to just start the way I was taught, which is trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus. Well, how am
Yeah.
I going to expect the next generation to trust somebody if they don't even think that person likes them? Or
Hmm.
even if they just think that person is just low grade mad at them all the time? So,
Yeah.
what if the starting point was not knowledge, behavior, guilt, fear? What if the starting place was a clear view of who he is and who he says you are? And
Yeah.
then what if trust was neither just sitting around passively or trying to figure it all out on your own, but just simply stepping into darkness and letting him lead you? And
Yeah.
so we really tried to frame it a different way and then created this experience guide to go with it. So we talked about shame a couple of minutes ago, to have
Yeah.
these relational experiences where you can like write down what some of your shame narratives are. And then together you can help each other replace these from a dry erase board and replace them with truth, and do this in the context of community. That's why we have these animation videos that go with it, these experience guides. So yeah, it was all part of hopefully getting people a different starting point in their walk with Jesus than maybe I had. And I don't know about you, maybe you had growing up.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how do you think about, because the systems and how they create a context or shape, narrative shape us, but so do systems. So, how do you think about systems?
And what do you mean by that? Tell me more of what you mean by that.
So you could think of it and as simple as you wake up in the morning to an alarm clock. It's a system to help you wake
Right.
up. So we have systems that help us do things,
Right.
and they let us do things that perhaps just as an individual, human, I might be limited, but now I have these resources to sort of
Right.
expand that. This book, you've created this ecosystem of resources um, within a community to sort of facilitate this experience. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're all a byproduct of systems, good or bad, right? So you
Yeah,
could say the educational system
yeah,
is designed to fit everybody into one mold model.
hmm
Like I think my oldest daughter, she was born for school. School is like a show up every day,
yeah,
take a bunch of classes, and if you're doing well, take harder classes. I mean, she's at a very difficult school scholastically, and she's doing really well. Learn some stuff, do some reports and all that. I mean, she is perfect for that.
yeah,
But what percentage of all teenagers is she? Right? I don't know. Is she 10%? Is she 25%? Certainly, the educational system is not designed for the way everybody should learn. Right?
mm,
I think even in the Christian world or the religious world, right? There's always this veer back to institutionalizing and systematizing things, which is you go, you sit, you listen, you learn, and then, hopefully you can go out and apply it in the real world, which is
yeah,
almost exactly the same as our educational system, right?
yeah,
And so this is our goal. We know some people like they're going to have to dip their toes into the water of the shallow end. So about half of my students in my student ministry, they do read books and they want to be left alone and read a book and then decide what they think about it. And then the next step for them would be to enter into a community of people, a community of friends they could live this out with and experience it together.
yeah,
But yeah, I think we're still working and thinking about is there can we continue to expand our system to reach new people in new places where they are with this message, which is a timeless message that we're trying
yeah,
to present in hopefully a new and fresh way.
yeah. So when does a system become tyrannical?
I think anytime that love begins to be replaced with something else,
Mm,
tyrannical may be too extreme of a word. It may be why you asked that question to try to pull this out of me, but it's like you know this by this all people will know that you are my disciples if you love one another, right?
hmm
What's the greatest command? Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Paul said, faith, hope, and love remain. The greatest of these is love. And
Yeah,
then Paul said, the fruit of the Spirit, the number one is love. Well, then how did Paul define love? Love is patient, love is kind. So a measure for, let's say, a Jesus system or a faith system should be patience and kindness should be at the top of the
hmm
list for the way we're
yeah,
measuring this. Because Jesus said, by this, all people will know you are my disciples. And then when Paul defined love, he started by saying love is patient, love is kind. And
yeah,
so when that becomes the measure for how we're doing is like let's say discipleship. Discipleship is loving God and others in a noticeably different way. Well, how can you tell that I'm loving other people in a noticeably different way? Well, according to Paul, it would start with patience and kindness. Well, if my church or my religious system is set up around, hey, the number one basis is knowledge, or the number one basis is devotion or dedication or tithing or giving or anything else
hmm
other than that, I wouldn't say it takes a little while longer to become tyrannical, to your point. But when you're starting to veer off,
yeah,
and you've seen throughout history, the church can veer off a little bit and then they can find themselves way off.
yeah,
Anytime love gets lost in the equation to something else, then we start having problems. And those problems can be small and those problems can be tyrannical.
yeah. So would you say that your experience, um, in terms of your identity and the things that you placed it in growing up, that put pressure on you to such a degree that that's why you blew up? So in other words, are you implying that there was a lack of love in the system that you grew up in?
I I I can't trace back to
Yeah.
my childhood or my church to see anything other than love being expressed to me. I don't know that it
Yeah.
was always taught to me from
Mm,
leaders, but a lot of times it was. I think somewhere I I did not have this mindset that I am a loved son of King Jesus
mm,
who's a good father. I was more like I am a low grade to mid grade disappointment who needs to get my act together. And
yeah.
so you remember the first Gladiator movie? It was Emperor. What was the guy's name? The Emperor that was played by
Um,
Joaquin Phoenix. You know,
yeah.
and so he would go out there with his thumb sideways and kind of
Hmm.
decide thumbs up or thumbs down. That was my view of God growing up. Was
Yeah.
just he was just always
Mm,
looking at me like this and trying to decide if it's thumbs up or thumbs down. Well, most of the time it was thumbs down, and I could tell you all the reasons why. So for me, there was no anchor of my identity from my creator as a loved son of my creator, because I just thought my creator was just always mad at me and
hmm.
always disappointed. I didn't know anything about, you know, what was true of me when I became a follower of Jesus. It was just like I got saved because my sister said I was going to hell, and then from then on I started trying to
Mm,
work to pay God back for for sparing me from all this stuff. And there was never this view. I mean, when you look at the Apostle Paul and he writes these letters to all these different churches, he always calls them like God's holy people. I have it up there. It's like chosen, holy, dearly loved saint. And,
yeah.
Paul's telling people, you were God's chosen people, or which is you were God's holy people, which is the definition of a saint. And
Yeah.
some of these churches were doing pretty well, and some of them, this was like a rebuke letter, like
Yeah.
making weird decisions, like weird ideology and stuff like that. And he starts by addressing them as God's holy people. And so I never would have seen myself that way. I was just a mess up who could not get it together enough. And so for me, it wasn't a standpoint of loving, it was a standpoint of being loved.
Hmm.
I lacked in the ability to love others because I did not see myself as a loved person. Now, you want to complicate that even further, Jason. You connect that to my childhood wounds of being unwanted, and now we have a full-on disaster ready to happen. Is this
Yeah.
guy doesn't see himself as loved by God? He doesn't see himself as wanted by other people. Well, what kind of decisions are you going to make? You're going to be
Yeah.
a ministry person who is so committed on achievement in order to get approval from people and approval from God at the same time. What a disaster waiting to happen, right?
Yeah. So if that person's watching us right now, what words of wisdom would you give them?
I think that if you think simply in terms of the difference between seeing yourself as a saint or a sinner, is are you a sinner who needs to work to be a saint, or are you a saint who occasionally sins? And again, I know not everybody watching this is a follower of Jesus, but it still may be good for you to hear this. Is when you look over 70 times, Paul refers to the people he's writing letters to as saints or God's holy people. And again, these are some Jews, some Gentiles, some doing well,
Hmm.
some making bad decisions, but he's referring to them for 11 chapters in Romans. He talks about their identity, and then he goes, therefore, and then he starts talking about some of their actions and their behavior. And so we're so committed to either fixing something on the external, or what we talked about earlier, finding our identity in something external. I would say to you watching this, it's a matter of understanding who are you really at your core.
Hmm.
And I had a counselor tell me one time, who you are at your core, no one should ever be able to shake that. And we are so prone to let people shake it, to let our external circumstances shake it. And so whether you're a Jesus follower or not, to find an anchor identity within yourself that is not at the whim of your job, like I did, or your money, like I did, or your kids, like I did, but something that is steadier than all of that stuff, a more solid foundation. That's what I would say.
So if that person hears that and is interested, where would they start?
In understanding their identity,
Yeah,
yeah,
what would be a starting point for them
yeah,
to
I would
as a step?
I mean, if you believe that there is a creator who created you, I think you could start by asking him. Um, and if you don't, I would say, what are where is the basis of worth that I can find within myself that does not fluctuate based on my external circumstances? So then it's a matter of speaking into who you are as a person, affirming what's true about you, and refusing to rehearse these things about you that aren't true. I mean, at the end of the day, our beliefs shape our behavior, right? And
Hmm.
I tell my students, if you believe you're a loser or an idiot, then if you fail a test, that's going to affirm what you already believe to be true about you. Well, where do those beliefs come from? Those beliefs come from your thoughts. Either you originated with that thought yourself, or maybe your dad said you were a loser when you were a kid and you rehearsed that to believe it. And so, really, I would say it starts in your thought life. What you believe to be true about you, which will inform your beliefs, which will inform your behavior, what you're thinking and repeating to yourself over and over again. So, start with the mental nutrition of who you are. Find some stuff to say about you that lines up with what you hope to be true about you, and begin rehearsing that, as opposed to what we're so prone to do, which is to rehearse stuff by default. That's usually rooted in our shame narrative that we're unaware of, or just letting our thoughts be random about ourselves. And then it all depends on how good a day we're having, how we feel like our hair looks, how people are responding to us. And we don't want to live lives that are that contingent on our circumstances.
Yeah. Well, anything else you want to share that you didn't get a chance to yet?
No, this was great. I appreciate it. I just trueface.org/the path. If anybody wants to check
Okay.
out the animation videos or the book or
So they
the
can
experience
they
guide.
can watch all the videos there at that.
Yeah, they're all in process. The first three are completed,
Oh,
and
okay.
we're releasing them one Wednesday at a time. So the first one
Cool.
just just released this past Wednesday. I don't know when this episode will go out, so it would be April 9th is when the first one released, and every Wednesday for the next 8 weeks we'll release
Cool.
those. And
Yeah.
so they'll be available. The book's available, the experience guide is available, and the animation videos are rolling out 1 week at a time.
So who's a good fit for this experience guide?
I started we started, I shall say, thinking about our own teenage kids, and then it expanded to teenagers and young people that we work with. I mean, did a ton of research on Gen Z as we worked on this. Probably, I mean, I myself probably did 6 months worth of just research on Gen Z. By the time it was all over, Jason, this is just a project for anybody. It's just for anybody. I mean, anybody searching for more purpose in life, and I think it's for people who are 15 and people who are 50. I think it's for people who have been in church and people who aren't sure what they think about all this. I mean, I hate to make it that general, but just by the time we got done with this project after 3 years, I was like, this is really for anybody.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the path. What if the way of Jesus is different than you thought, which ties into our conversation about life being different than we expect.
Right.
Perhaps the God of the universe is also different than we expected. So
That's right.
cool. Well, Benjamin, thank you so much for sharing your life with us today.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks for asking all these thought provoking questions, and some were revealing. So yeah, I appreciate your insight.